How long do you plan on standing there before you admit you've never seen someone like me? Riken spoke the words under his breath, but they still echoed in the cramped corridor of the salvaged starship. He hadn't intended them to come out so sharply. Heat and the stench of burnt metal radiated from the half-sparking console in front of him, but his attention was glued to the tall, slender alien woman who observed him with quiet intensity. She had approached unexpectedly, her footsteps feather-light on the grated floor. He caught the faint luminescence trailing in the air around her hips, and his heart thumped in response, an odd mixture of curiosity and unnerved awareness. She eyed him from across the mess of wires coiling at his feet, and though she spoke no words, her tail flicked once, then curled around her thighs with slow deliberation. Riken's eyes drifted to that tail, and he instantly felt a strange, unexpected desire to know how it felt beneath his hand. He hadn't met many non-human species who displayed any form of trust or interest in him, let alone a kind of charged silence that teased his senses. He cleared his throat, rummaging around for the plasma torch, pretending not to be so captivated. The starship's corridor was lit by flickering emergency lights, enough to show him the sharp planes of her face, prominent cheekbones, eyes slightly larger than a human's, a faint glow at the edges of her pupils. Her name, Zyril, rang in his thoughts. They'd both ended up in this derelict outpost after escaping a corporate patrol. Riken, ever the pilot for hire with a tendency to get in trouble, had come here seeking a rumored stash of black market engine parts. Zyril, as far as he could guess, had come for her own reasons, though she had yet to share them. He suspected she was on the run too. Maybe an exile. Maybe a fugitive. But that tail, and the tension in her luminous skin, made him think there was more to her than a simple runaway. He was about to ask her to hand him a spare coupler when her slender fingers wrapped around it first. She held it out without meeting his eyes, but the subtle shift in her posture told him she was watching everything about him. Her faintly scaled arms, shimmering from the overhead lights, were angled as though she could vanish into the shadows if need be. There was a predatory grace about her, but also a vulnerability in how she blinked, how her tail swished whenever he drew too close. He coughed, recollecting himself, and pressed the coupler into the corroded manifold. Sparks sputtered, and the lights overhead steadied for a moment. He tested a switch. The console spat garbled data, but it was progress. "That's better," he mumbled, brushing a bead of sweat from his brow. When he turned to look at her, he realized she stood inches away. He caught the faint smell of something sweet, maybe a natural pheromone her species emitted. There was no doubt she was fully sentient, a powerful presence, and that shimmering skin was no simple aesthetic. She placed a single hand over his to get his attention. Her claws were retracted, but he could still feel their edges against his glove. She didn't speak in a voice he could understand. Instead, a low hum resonated from her throat. "What are you trying to say?" he asked softly. Her eyes flickered with an otherworldly glow, scanning his face. He sensed she was testing him, or maybe making an offering of trust. Her lips parted, uttering carefully spaced syllables. The universal translator clipped to Riken's belt sputtered to life, trying to decode. Static whined, then a few words came through in a halting monotone. "You fix ship together?" He almost laughed at the awkward question, so mechanical in its translation. But her eyes were anything but mechanical. They radiated an intensity that made him swallow. "Yes. Together," he answered, carefully drawing his hand back from under hers. He didn't want to appear too eager or too dismissive. She watched him, that flickering interest never leaving her gaze. Then, in a delicate sweep, she turned to peer down the corridor. The gentle sway of her hips and the languid motion of her tail were impossible for Riken to ignore. Despite the swirling tension between them, he tried to refocus on the console, prying away a burnt panel and sifting through the wires for any sign of salvageable tech. The hush between them was thick with unspoken curiosity. Every so often, he caught her stealing glances at him, or maybe it was he who was stealing them at her, as though they were both drawn by a gravitational field neither had anticipated. He reminded himself that they were in dangerous territory. This outpost wasn't just some abandoned husk. Rumors said slavers and corporate goons had started combing the edges of the sector. They wouldn't hesitate to take them both for profit if they discovered them here. Even so, he couldn't quell the slow burn inside his chest. Her presence was magnetic, more than just physical allure, it was the sense of shared survival. The translator made a few more clicks, then repeated a snippet of something Zyro must have said to herself, presumably in her native tongue. Cold, lonely, find warmth. He looked over at her, unsure if he should respond, not certain of the context. Her brows furrowed, and she let out a soft hiss, as though irritated by the device's flawed interpretation. She turned abruptly and started down the corridor. Riken hesitated only a moment before he abandoned the smoking console to follow. He trailed her through the winding passages, stepping over debris and the occasional skeleton of some ancient mechanical drone. The deeper they ventured, the more battered the walls became. A few times she held up a hand in warning, scanning the darkness for potential threats. He admired her vigilance. She moved with the poised readiness of someone used to conflict. Her tail occasionally brushed the corridor's walls, the scaled ridges catching on the dim light, and he felt that same flicker of electricity every time he laid eyes on its graceful arc. They slipped through a half-jammed hatch into a chamber that might once have been a galley. Tables lay overturned, scraps of rations scattered on the floor. Beyond a partition, Riken heard a low mechanical hum. Zyro pointed, the faint glow in her fingertips seeming to intensify. Riken nodded, stepping ahead to investigate. The corridor beyond was unlit, so he flipped on a small handheld lantern. The beam fell across a sealed door, rust creeping along its edges. Above it, an alien script that he couldn't read. He turned to Zyro, whose eyes glowed softly, scanning the writing with practiced familiarity. She traced a single clawed finger across the script. Safe chamber. The translator relayed in staccato bursts. Medical, records, healing. She cocked her head at him, then at the door, as though suggesting they investigate. Riken shrugged. We could see if there's anything valuable inside. Maybe you need supplies. She gave a low, affirmative hum. He approached the door's control panel, which was half corroded but still powered. Zyro stepped close beside him, close enough that he could feel the subtle heat emanating from her body. Or was that the flush of his own blood, betraying the effect she had on him? He forced himself to concentrate on the door's manual override. As soon as he managed to force the rusted mechanism, the door groaned and slid open a crack. Enough for her to squeeze through if she turned sideways, her tail brushing his leg. The contact startled him, an unexpected stroke of scaled warmth that sent a shiver racing through his skin. She paused, her eyes meeting his in the dim light. There was something searching in her gaze, as if she wanted to see how he'd react to this accidental touch. He felt a rush of awkwardness at how intensely he was staring at her tail. It was such a foreign, entrancing feature. Instinctively, he felt that strange urge to run his hand along it, even to hold it. He swallowed, turned his face away, and gestured for her to move forward. She parted her lips slightly, a fleeting smile that might have been a smirk, and disappeared through the gap in the door. He followed, inhaling the stale air of the safe chamber. Inside, racks of containerized vials, battered medical pods, and half-smashed cabinets gave the place a somber quality. Zyro ran her hands over a steel table, scanning for anything of use. Riken rummaged through a few compartments, finding outdated stims and half-charged field kits. He tested one on the back of his glove. The readout was partially operational but probably worth keeping. We might get some credits for these, he murmured, stuffing them into his pack. He found her at the far end of the room, crouched beside a storage locker. Something about her posture seemed guarded. As he approached, she twisted to glance back at him. Her eyes were luminous with an emotion he couldn't name. She jerked her chin at the locker's electronic lock. He crouched down, setting his lantern on the floor. The lock was advanced but old, with a cluster of wires that reminded him of older Terran security systems. With practiced hands he pried off the cover and bypassed the crusted circuits. The lock beeped weakly, and the heavy door swung open. A stench of preservatives drifted out. Inside were canisters of some alien fluid, maybe a healing solution. Zyro's mouth parted, and she uttered something that made the translator garble, but there was a reverence in her expression. She reached out, brushing her fingertips over the nearest canister's inscription. Whatever these were, they seemed important to her. Seeing the solemn way she touched them, Riken found himself suppressing a wave of sympathy. Maybe these canisters were part of her people's medicinal tradition or crucial for her survival. Without warning, the door behind them slid shut, presumably on an automatic timer. The stale air thickened. Zyro turned to face him, inches separating them. Her tail twitched, brushing his boot. He felt a sudden spike of tension. They were alone, in a sealed space, with the hum of half-functional fans overhead. She looked at him through those glowing eyes, and he sensed a hunger that wasn't just about the canisters. It was as if the adrenaline of their flight from danger, the forced closeness in these cramped corridors, and the unspoken curiosity had all coalesced into this moment. He tried to think of something witty to say, but the words never formed. Her gaze dropped to his chest, then rose again. She leaned in, and Riken felt the brush of her breath against his jaw. He instinctively raised a hand, and it landed at the curve of her waist, just above her tail's base. A spark of awareness flashed through both of them. The translator was silent. There were no words for the raw heat that flared when her scaled abdomen pressed against him. She let out a low, throaty sound that was half hum, half gasp, something that ignited the blood in Riken's veins. Yet the moment cracked as soon as it began. She pulled back abruptly, turning her face away. Her tail flicked with a snap, and she exhaled shakily. Riken's heart pounded in his ears. He reminded himself that they were strangers. If he pushed too far, too fast, he risked losing whatever fragile trust they had. He tried to steady his breathing. "We should see if there's another exit," he managed. She nodded tersely, her shoulders tense, and they set about exploring the rest of the chamber. After a few minutes of examining dusty terminals, Riken found an override for the door. It hissed open, letting them slip back out into the corridor. The stale tension lingered like a haze. Zyro led the way, her tail swaying in fluid arcs. He could see the faint trembling in her limbs, as if the moment they'd shared had shaken her composure. For his part, he was no less rattled. They continued searching the outpost until they emerged in a wider central atrium that must have been an operations hub. A massive window overlooked a dim, star-flecked expanse. Hovering near the window were crates of mechanical debris, rotting supply boxes, and a few exposed cables that snaked around. The overhead lighting was half broken, casting everything in flickering shadows. In the center of the floor, a wide dais of polished metal, tarnished by time, looked like it had once been used for official ceremonies. Zyro approached it cautiously, scanning the markings etched along its sides. Riken eased in behind her, noting an emptiness in the air. Something about this place felt haunted. She knelt down, trailing her fingers over symbols that glowed faintly under her touch. Her species might have shared some heritage with whoever built this station, or maybe she was just gifted at deciphering alien scripts. He watched the colors shifting across her scales, trying not to stare too openly. But she seemed so focused that she didn't notice. When she rose, her face was set in determination. She gestured for him to follow once more. They wound through another corridor, stumbling over collapsed beams and twisted pieces of hull plating. She slipped occasionally, and Riken offered his hand to steady her. Each time their palms met, there was a jolt of awareness that made them both pause. He sensed the tension in her, a guarded readiness that told him she wasn't used to letting anyone close. Yet she didn't pull away from his grip. Something in her wanted the contact. They finally reached a sealed hatch with an alien crest etched into it. She ran her palm across the crest, and a whir of ancient machinery sounded. The translator squeaked. "Key passage sanctuary?" it offered, uncertain. Riken guessed it meant some kind of hidden refuge. The hatch retracted, revealing a narrower tunnel sloping downward into dimness. Zyro's tail flicked once more, glancing off Riken's thigh in passing, and she moved into the tunnel without hesitation. Riken sucked in a breath and trudged after her, that persistent hum of tension simmering between them. The descent took longer than he liked. He was half expecting an ambush, maybe from pirates or corporate enforcers, but the tunnels remained eerily silent, the only sound their own careful footsteps. The corridor's walls became more polished the deeper they went, until they reached a heavily reinforced door that shimmered with advanced locks. Cyril examined it for a moment, then used a combination of touches on a panel. To Riken's surprise, the locks disengaged with a hiss, and the door slid open to reveal a spacious, hidden chamber filled with soft, pulsing lights. The air here was warm, moister than in the rest of the outpost, and it smelled of alien blossoms or something akin to them. Strange carved pillars lined the walls, each emanating a faint bioluminescent glow. At the center was a pool of shimmering liquid that reflected the pastel lights overhead. Cyril's expression grew solemn. She approached the pool with reverence, kneeling at its edge. Her tail coiled around her legs, as if she were in the presence of something sacred. Riken took a cautious step closer, glancing from her to the glowing liquid. He wanted to speak, but words felt inappropriate. The translator was silent as well, as though uncertain it should intrude. Cyril dipped one hand into the pool, and the glow spread across her arm, accentuating the faint scale pattern that ran under her skin. She drew a soft, trembling breath. Whatever this place was, it must have been precious to her kind, maybe a healing spring, a spiritual site, or some synergy of both. Riken felt a pang of guilt for intruding. He kept his distance, letting her have a private moment. But after a few breaths she looked over her shoulder and beckoned him gently. Her eyes held a question, or maybe an invitation. He approached slowly, stopping just behind her. She gazed at his reflection in the pool, then dipped her fingers back into the liquid and lifted them, letting glowing droplets slip through the air. They fell across his gloved hand, leaving luminescent trails that quickly faded. Her lips curved into something resembling a soft smile. He knelt beside her, uncertain, but compelled to share in this moment. She gently peeled off his glove, and he allowed it, feeling the warmth of her scales against his bare skin. Then she took his hand and guided it into the pool. The water, or whatever it was, felt silky, imbued with some subtle energy. Riken let out a slow breath, his mind flashing with the sheer wonder of it. Cyril's fingers curled around his under the surface, and he could feel the quickening of her pulse in that point of contact. He looked at her, and she turned her head, their faces inches apart. The hush of the chamber seemed to cradle them in an otherworldly intimacy. Her tail shifted, brushing his back lightly. He reached up with his free hand to gently rest it along her jaw, his fingers just grazing the edge of a scaled ridge near her ear. She inhaled sharply, eyes fluttering. He half expected her to pull away, but she leaned in, as though crossing a boundary that had kept her solitary for too long. Their lips met in a tentative brush, an unspoken question of trust. Her skin was smooth, slightly cool, but it warmed under his touch. Her breath tasted faintly of that sweet, flowery scent he'd noticed before. Riken's heart hammered like a distant war drum. In the watery reflection, he saw a swirl of glowing colors dancing across their interlocked silhouettes. When they finally broke apart, she pressed her forehead to his, exhaling softly. The translator on his belt crackled, but only static sounded, as if no words could capture the moment. Before they could deepen this fragile bond, the overhead lights flickered. Distant echoes of metal clanging up the tunnel shattered the quiet. Cyril jerked upright, scanning with alarm. Riken tensed, switching to a combat mindset. "Someone's here," he muttered, pulling his glove back on. Cyril rose gracefully, tail lashing in agitation. She pointed to a side passage. They moved swiftly, guided by the pulsing lights. Riken drew his sidearm, the hum of the power cell a small comfort in his grip. Cyril didn't appear to carry a weapon, but the tension in her stance told him she was far from defenseless. They slipped away from the main pool just as footsteps approached. A squad of armed figures emerged through the main entrance, flashlights slicing through the dark. Riken cursed under his breath. They were corporate raiders, or maybe slavers, the difference didn't matter. They spoke in hushed tones, scanning the chamber for signs of life. Cyril pressed herself against a carved pillar, eyes fierce. She glanced at Riken, a silent question in her expression. Fight or flee? He weighed their odds. They were outnumbered, but the chamber offered some cover. We can't let them corner us in here, he whispered. She nodded, scanning for a path around the intruders. The glowing pillars provided enough of a labyrinth to move undetected if they timed it right. Keeping low, Riken led the way behind one broad pillar, listening to the men's voices. Snatches of conversation told him they were here for the technology. Probably that pool, or the canisters from earlier. One man mentioned capturing the occupant if they found one. Riken gritted his teeth. He wasn't about to let them turn Zyril into a lab specimen, or a prisoner. They crept around the perimeter, avoiding flashlight beams, until they spotted an open corridor on the far side. The problem was the corridor was partially caved in, leaving just a narrow passage. It would take them directly behind two of the armed men. Zyril's eyes glowed with quiet determination. She motioned at Riken to wait, then slipped forward. He watched in awe as she dissolved into the gloom, tail held rigid for balance. A moment later, one of the men gave a startled grunt. Another hissed something in confusion. Riken heard a scuffle, and in a flash, Zyril reappeared, pressing a finger to her lips. The men were unconscious at her feet. Heart pounding, Riken ran to join her, careful not to make noise. She glided ahead, showing him how effortlessly she could handle threats. He felt a spark of admiration that rivaled his growing desire for her. They slipped past the incapacitated men and hurried down the narrow corridor, stepping over fallen debris. Shouts arose behind them as the others realized something was wrong. Riken picked up the pace, adrenaline burning in his veins. They reached the end of the corridor, confronted by another sealed hatch. Zyril quickly keyed in a sequence on a battered panel, ignoring the flicker of fear in her eyes. Come on, Riken muttered, eyeing the corridor behind them. Footsteps pounded closer. At the last second, the hatch slid open, and they rushed inside. Zyril hit the panel again, and the hatch sealed with a metallic clang. Seconds later, fists hammered on the other side, accompanied by shouts. Riken exhaled in relief, running a hand through his sweat-damp hair. The chamber they found themselves in was cramped, filled with broken containers and swirling dust motes. A single vent overhead provided dim, flickering light from the outpost's compromised systems. Zyril looked exhausted, her shoulders trembling slightly from the confrontation. Riken approached her cautiously, lifting a hand as if to say it was okay. She sagged against him, letting out a ragged sigh. His arms slid around her, pulling her close. Her tail wrapped around his waist with a tentative squeeze, and the translator caught a soft murmur from her throat, something that sounded like gratitude. He could feel her heartbeat, fast and unsteady. Yeah, well, he whispered, words trailing off. He didn't know how to comfort her in her own language, so he relied on touch. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, her scales smooth against his skin. That quiet moment felt fragile, stolen in the midst of chaos. Then the hatch groaned under repeated blows. They wouldn't be safe here for long. Zyril pulled away, her eyes fierce again. She jabbed a thumb toward an ascending ladder that disappeared into darkness. Riken nodded, heading over to test it. The rungs held his weight. Without wasting time, they climbed up into a maintenance shaft. Zyril followed close behind, tail occasionally brushing his calves. At the top, a loose grate led them into another corridor. The pounding on the hatch below faded into echoes. They hurried on, hearts still thundering, searching for a route that might lead them out of the outpost altogether. Zyril paused at a junction, checking a half-lit sign scrawled with alien text. The translator tried to parse it. Docking bay old entrance. Riken's spirits lifted. So there's a docking bay down this way? He asked. She gave a curt nod, forging ahead. The corridor eventually opened into a wide hangar-like space, half collapsed from years of neglect. Spidery cracks radiated across the vaulted ceiling. A single battered starship, a small corvette class by the looks of it, rested on the deck, covered in dust and cobwebbed cables. Zyril halted, her eyes scanning the vessel. She turned to Riken, a question on her face. Could they get it running? He rubbed his jaw, pondering the heavily corroded thrusters and half-missing hull plating. Might be a lost cause, he muttered. But maybe we can salvage a short-range hop out of here. Zyral's tail flicked once, an anxious motion. She led him around the side of the Corvette, and they found an access ramp that was jammed halfway open. With some effort, they managed to wedge it down enough to climb aboard. The interior was dank, stale air swirling with dust. Panels flickered in the gloom. Riken headed for the cockpit, stepping around broken seats and scattered components. Zyral followed, staying close. The cockpit was in better shape than he expected. He powered up the console. A dim hum and a flicker of lights suggested there was some life left in the ship's core systems. He started running diagnostics while Zyral checked compartments and side panels. The engines were shot, but the reactor still had minimal functionality. They might manage a short jump or a sublight hop, but not much else. Still, it beat waiting to be captured. The pounding of approaching footsteps down the corridor told him time was short. He motioned Zyral to the co-pilot's seat, but she lingered behind him, scanning a readout on a secondary console. He yanked on the thruster controls. They hissed in protest, but the onboard AI indicated partial readiness. If they could open the hangar doors, they had a chance. Zyral pointed to a battered control station near the cockpit's rear. It likely managed the outpost's external bay doors. She moved to it, trying a series of commands, but the system spat out error messages and cryptic glyphs. Manual override, Riken said, sprinting for the hatch on the ship's starboard side. He found a panel that presumably opened an external port on the Corvette. Through it, they might access the bay door mechanisms. Zyral joined him, and together they pried the panel open. A narrow walkway led to an elevated catwalk that ringed the hangar. At the far end, a massive lever-like device protruded from the wall, likely the manual release for the bay doors. Riken slid onto the catwalk, scanning for threats. The corridor they'd entered from was filled with angry shouts. Their pursuers were closing in. He beckoned Zyral after him, and they dashed across the catwalk. Halfway there, a group of 3 armed figures spilled into the hangar below. Spotting them, they raised weapons and fired. Energy blasts sizzled past. Riken and Zyral ducked behind the catwalk's railing. Zyral hissed, glancing at him. He nodded, steeling himself. He leaned out and returned fire with his sidearm. One of the men jerked back, going down in a flash of sparks. The other 2 scattered. Zyral used the moment to sprint along the catwalk. Her tail swayed for balance as she wove around incoming blasts. Riken laid down cover fire, each shot echoing in the cavernous space. She reached the lever, yanked on it. It refused to budge at first, but she applied her full strength. With a grinding screech, it slowly gave way. In the hangar ceiling, the massive doors began to part, rust flaking off as starlight poured in. A swirling wind buffeted the interior. The men below cursed, apparently realizing they were about to lose their prey. Riken seized Zyral's hand, pulling her back along the catwalk as the overhead doors fully opened. The vacuum of space would have sucked them out if the outpost's atmospheric shields weren't still partially active. But the place was losing pressure fast. They dove back into the Corvette through the side hatch, slamming it shut behind them. Riken raced to the cockpit, adrenaline surging. "Strap in!" he barked, though she only caught half his words. Still, she slid into the co-pilot's seat, eyes wide with urgency. Riken powered the thrusters. They whined and sparked, but roared to life. He slammed the control yoke forward, lifting the Corvette off the deck. The battered ship shuddered as it rose unsteadily, scraping a support beam overhead. "Come on, girl," he muttered to the craft, coaxing it to cooperate. A final push of thrust propelled them up and out of the hangar, into the star-flecked darkness. Sirens wailed behind them, but once they cleared the outpost, Riken put as much distance as he could between them and the looming facility. The engines rattled, the readouts blinking all sorts of warnings. It didn't matter. They were free. Zyral stared out the cockpit window, her face bathed in the glow of distant stars. Riken checked the NAV data. Most systems were offline, but they had enough power to drift a while. At least they weren't about to be captured. Panting, he slumped in his chair and turned to look at her. A mixture of relief and residual desire swirled in his chest. She met his gaze, her expression uncertain, but there was a flicker of gratitude there, maybe more. He rose from the pilot's seat, crossing to her. She watched him with a guarded curiosity. He reached out, gently grazing the side of her face, where a bruise had formed from the earlier tussle. She flinched, then relaxed as he stroked softly. Her eyes half-lidded. He traced along her jawline, marveling at the silky texture of her scales. Her breath caught. Then, that tail of hers lifted slightly, curling around his wrist with delicate pressure. "You okay?" he murmured, though he knew she likely couldn't understand the exact words. Her tail loosened, sliding away. She leaned forward, bridging the gap between them. Her lips brushed his, a silent answer that made his chest tighten. The translator might not catch it, but he understood. He pulled her closer, feeling the unsteady beat of his own heart as their mouths met in a deeper, searching kiss. She exhaled against his lips, her tension slowly melting, replaced by the heat of their mutual relief and the heady pulse of adrenaline. When they broke apart, her gaze flicked to his belt, to the translator. She made a series of low sounds, and the device churned out an approximation. "Thank you, risk to save." He couldn't help a wry smile. "You saved me more times than I saved you," he answered softly. She shook her head, pressing her fingertips to his chest as though sensing the thrumming heart behind his ribcage. Her tail curled around his leg, an unconscious movement that made him gasp slightly. He led her back to the cockpit console, guiding her to the co-pilot's seat. The cramped space forced their bodies to brush. She inhaled sharply but didn't move away. "We should see how far we can get in this hunk of junk," he said, checking the star charts. They had limited navigation, but there was a small planetoid about a day's drift away. Maybe they could land or scavenge for fuel. Zyro leaned over the instruments, understanding his intentions without words. She pointed to the planetoid, nodding. So that was the plan. They'd limp there, recharge or at least rest. Riken set a course, letting the autopilot keep them on track, though it was rudimentary at best. Once everything was stable, he locked the controls and turned to her. The hush of the cabin was underscored by the rhythmic hum of the failing engines. She sat quietly, her gaze drifting over the starlit void outside. He was suddenly hyper-aware of their closeness, the fact that they were alone now, with no immediate danger. He reached out and touched her shoulder. She flinched slightly, then relaxed, allowing his fingers to drift along the base of her neck. Her eyes closed, and she let out a soft hum, reminiscent of a purr. He'd never been so captivated by another being, human or otherwise. She radiated an otherworldly grace and a raw emotional vulnerability. He found himself transfixed by the shifting colors in her scales, the subtle glow that pulsed with her heartbeat. Leaning in, he pressed his lips to the side of her neck, feeling her shudder at the contact. Her fingers dug lightly into his arms as she turned her head, giving him better access. The translator lay useless at their waist, but they didn't need it to convey what they felt. His hands moved down, tracing the curve of her waist, tentatively brushing the base of her tail. She jerked slightly, letting out a breathy sound that was part surprise, part intrigue. He froze, concerned he'd crossed the line. But she turned to face him, hooking her tail around his leg once more, almost as if encouraging him. A wave of heat surged through him. He remembered that moment in the corridor when her tail had accidentally caressed him. The memory of his own fascination with it fueled a heady mix of embarrassment and desire. Their mouths fused again, hungrier this time. He tasted the salty tang of sweat and the sweetness of her alien pheromones. His hands slid further, lingering at the juncture where her tail sprouted from her back. She let out a low moan, pressing herself against him so tightly he felt the ridges of her scales through his clothes. The moment pulsed with a shared desperation, for comfort, for release, for any reassurance that they were alive and free. At some point, they staggered away from the cockpit, stumbling down a narrow corridor to a small sleeping berth. The door hissed shut behind them, providing a semblance of privacy. The overhead emergency lights cast them in a dim red glow. They stood there, breathing heavily, hearts thundering. She lifted a hand, gently tracing the lines of his face, as if memorizing every curve. He did the same, running his fingertips over her cheeks, her lips, the sweep of her brow. Their gazes locked in a kind of silent understanding. They might not share a language, but they shared this moment. Then, with a sudden surge of urgency, she tugged at the fastenings of his flight suit, growling softly at the stubborn clasps. He chuckled, helping her, and soon the material was peeled away, revealing sweat-slicked skin. She let out that humming purr again, pressing her palm to his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart. He thought of asking if she was sure, but the way she pressed herself to him, the light in her eyes, told him all he needed to know. She was certain. And so was he. His hands found her waist, exploring the textured ridges of her torso, the soft glow under her skin that pulsed with every breath. When he brushed a particularly sensitive patch near her ribs, she gasped, tail snapping in a reflex. He caught it without thinking, his palm closing around the scaled length. She stiffened, letting out a trembling exhale. He released it gently, sensing she was skittish. But to his surprise, she guided his hand back, encouraging him to hold it again. The next moments blurred in a haze of heated exploration. Their clothing, what little she wore, mostly wraps over her torso, fell away. He reveled in the foreign beauty of her form, the curve of her hips, the slight luminescence that marked her vitals. Their shared desire simmered with the desperation of two survivors finding solace in each other's presence. She guided his hand up her back and around the base of her tail, showing him how to hold it. Her breath stuttered each time he tightened his grip, an exhilarating discovery that sent sparks down his spine. In the low red light, he pressed her back against the bulkhead, capturing her mouth in a fervent kiss. Her claws grazed his shoulders, leaving faint tingles of pain and pleasure in equal measure. She nipped at his lower lip, a playful flick of her elongated canine. A flush of excitement rose in him at the sharp sting. He responded by gripping her tail, feeling its powerful musculature tense under his fingers. She whimpered into his mouth, arching forward, her body trembling with pent-up need. They tumbled onto the narrow bunk, limbs entwined. The old mattress creaked under their combined weight. Her tail curled around his waist, pulling him tighter, as if she wanted to merge with him entirely. The flicker of overhead lights cast dancing shadows across their bodies. Each stolen gasp of air was charged with the scent of her pheromones. His hands roamed her scaled skin, memorizing every plane and ridge. She responded with a series of soft hisses and moans, pressing her hips into his. When his palm landed a playful smack on her tail, she jolted, eyes flying open. A startled hiss escaped her lips, morphing quickly into a breathy moan. He froze, worried he'd caused genuine pain. But she stared at him with darkened pupils, chest heaving, and eased her tail under his hand again, as though inviting him to repeat the gesture. His heart hammered at the realization that this was a line of intimacy for her kind, maybe a taboo zone. But her parted lips and the flush of her cheeks told him she wanted it. The translator was silent, leaving them in a primal realm of moans and touches. He cautiously obliged, giving her tail another controlled smack. She arched her back and let out a strangled cry that resonated in the metal walls. A spark of feral delight flared in her eyes. He swallowed, adrenaline spiking. With each playful swat, her moans grew sharper, until she was trembling beneath him. At some point, she collapsed into his arms, face nestled against his neck, whimpering softly each time she tried to move and put pressure on her tail. He stroked her hairline and kissed the ridges there, offering comfort. She clung to him, body thrumming with the aftermath of an intense surge of sensation. He whispered reassuring nonsense against her ear, though the translator didn't bother to interpret. Gradually, her breathing steadied, and he felt her lips curve against his collarbone in a subdued, contented smile. They drifted into a doze, limbs tangled, with only the dull thrum of the Corvette's engines as a lullaby. The tension and fear that had chased them through the outpost seemed distant in that fleeting moment of post-intimacy warmth. Riken felt a surge of protectiveness welling in his chest. He didn't even know the full extent of Zyro's story, why she was running or what she needed from that station, but he knew he wanted to keep her safe. Maybe it was foolish sentiment. He'd seen enough of the galaxy to know better than to trust easily. But something about her was different, drawing out a tenderness he hadn't felt in years. They woke to a beeping on the main console, signaling a malfunction. Groggy and still entwined, they exchanged a startled look before scrambling to dress. Zyra winced when she set her tail down, a tiny whimper escaping her as it brushed the bunk. Riken felt a pang of guilt, but also a guilty thrill at the memory of her fervent response. She caught his expression and offered a shy, teasing smirk. The translator remained silent, but the look in her eyes said enough. The Corvette's alert indicated failing reactor coolant. Riken cursed under his breath. He quickly pulled on his boots and dashed to the cockpit, Zyra limping slightly but following determinedly. The readout was dire, the reactor was overheating, and they risked a critical meltdown within hours unless they could vent or refuel. The planetoid was still half a day away at their sluggish pace. He glared at the console as though that might fix the issue. Zyra pressed a button on the co-pilot console, scanning the sensor readouts. She hissed softly, glancing at him with concern. "We might not make it," he said with a grim sigh. "Unless we find another place to land or repair." Zyra leaned closer to the display, tapping a series of coordinates. The translator crackled, spitting out bits of meaning. "Nearby small settlement, deserted?" She was pointing at a faint reading on the edge of the sensor's range. Riken studied it. A dwarf planet or large asteroid with trace atmosphere, possibly an abandoned mining station. It was closer than the planetoid. They could be there in a few hours if the reactor didn't blow first. He set course for that location, pushing the Corvette's engines as best he could. Zyra vanished into the corridor, presumably to see if she could patch up some coolant lines. Riken glanced back, unable to resist a pang of worry. The memory of her whimpers teased his mind, but he shook it off. They needed to survive. Lust would have to wait. He refocused on coaxing every bit of speed from the battered vessel. Time slipped by in taut silence. Occasional alarms blared, prompting him to reroute power. Eventually Zyra returned, grime smudged across her scaled arms. She shook her head, tail drooping, indicating that her patch job wasn't enough. But she'd bought them a bit more time. He nodded, heart pounding, and prayed they could reach the settlement before the ship turned into a fireball. An hour later they broke through the sparse atmosphere of a cold, rocky world. Craggy cliffs and black sands stretched beneath them, lit by a faint star. In the distance, the outline of a domed facility clung to a jagged hillside. Riken guided the Corvette down, ignoring the screech of metal as the landing struts met the gritty surface. The engine sputtered and died the second they touched down. He released a shaky breath, scanning the exterior cameras. The settlement looked abandoned indeed, with the dome cracked in places. Flickers of light suggested minimal power inside. They hurried to the airlock, suiting up in battered environment gear from the ship's storage. Zyra's outfit was ill-fitting, but it protected her from the thin atmosphere. She strapped a small respirator to her face, eyes glowing with determination. Together, they exited the Corvette, boots crunching on black sand. The air was frigid, stinging Riken's exposed cheeks. The only sound was the hiss of wind and their own breath. The station's main hatch was sealed, but the power panel still showed a flicker of functionality. Zyra fiddled with it, entering commands in a language the translator barely recognized. At length, the hatch creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. They stepped inside, the hatch sealing behind them. Musty air greeted them, slightly more pressurized than outside. Zyra tested her respirator, then carefully removed it, inhaling tentatively. She coughed, but it was breathable enough. Riken followed suit. The corridor ahead was lined with broken lights and crumpled signs. They passed a row of storage units, their surfaces rusted. The translator caught bits of text that read, "Mining tools, maintenance supplies, air filtration." This place had been a mining outpost once. Perhaps they could find coolant or parts to help them patch the Corvette's reactor. They spread out, each searching different corridors. Riken pried open a jammed door, rummaging through a dusty storeroom. Half the crates were empty, but he found a container of coolant canisters in the back. He nearly whooped with joy. Dragging the heavy canisters out, he realized there were only 2, but it might be enough to keep the reactor stable. He called for Zyril, following the soft glow that marked her silhouette in the gloom. She was in a larger room, presumably the station's command center. A faint hum came from battered consoles arranged in a semicircle around a wide viewport. She was typing alien commands into a central terminal. When he arrived, she motioned for him to come see. The translator beeped. Possible, meltdown risk, station, generator. He frowned, glancing at the readouts. The station's generator was also on the verge of failing. Great. Not only was their ship close to meltdown, but the station was too. He groaned, dropping the coolant canisters at his feet. We can't catch a break, he muttered. They had a quick, hushed discussion. She wanted to stabilize the station's generator while he fixed the Corvette's reactor. If the station blew, it'd take them with it. He hesitated to leave her alone, but she insisted. She gave him the translator. She'd learned enough of the console's language that she didn't need it as much as he did. Then she pressed her palm against his chest, sliding it up to the side of his neck, and pulled him down for a brief, intense kiss. It felt like a vow of trust, a promise to return. He cradled her face in his hands, returning the kiss with urgency. You come back to me, all right? He whispered, though he knew the translator wouldn't catch the nuance. She pulled away, offering a small smirk, the flicker of that playful, determined spark in her eyes. Then she took one of the coolant canisters and disappeared down a corridor. Riken watched her go, worry gnawing at his gut. He picked up the remaining canister and hurried back to the surface to fix the Corvette before it turned into molten slag. Cold wind stung his cheeks as he jogged across the black sand to where the Corvette rested. The hull shimmered with residual heat. Using the ship's manual override, he forced the cargo bay open and climbed inside. The temperature difference was jarring. Inside was blisteringly hot from the struggling reactor. He peeled off the environment suit's top layer, wincing at the stuffy air. Alarms blared from the engineering bay, which glowed a dangerous orange hue. He set down the canister, popped the reactor's access panel, and coughed at the acrid fumes. Carefully, he hooked up the coolant line. The canister hissed, injecting the precious fluid into the system. The reactor temperature readout dropped a few degrees. Not enough. He cursed, adjusting the flow. Slowly, the reactor stabilized in the lower red zone, still precarious but less explosive. Satisfied he'd done all he could, he collapsed against the bulkhead, wiping sweat from his brow. The metal floor vibrated under him, humming with the Corvette's uneasy heartbeat. He inhaled, thinking of Zyril. Would she succeed in stabilizing the station? She was alone, and though she was adept at engineering, the place was a crumbling ruin. He forced himself to stand, determined to check on her. He donned his environment suit again and stepped out onto the black sand. The horizon glowed faintly from the distant star. The wind whispered across the rock, swirling dust around his boots. Inside the station, the corridors felt even more claustrophobic now that he knew the generator was failing. He retraced his steps to the command center, but she wasn't there. A half-lit display indicated the generator room was below, at sublevel 3. Navigating the station's bowels was tricky. Collapsed walkways and sealed sections forced him to detour. Eventually, he reached a long hallway lined with huge pipes. Steam hissed from a few ruptures, adding to the oppressive heat. He found a hatch marked with bright alien glyphs. The translator read, "Generator access, authorized personnel only." He pried it open, fighting the squealing hinges. Beyond lay a massive chamber dominated by a central reactor-like structure, arcs of energy dancing across it ominously. Zyril was perched on a console platform halfway up the unit, working furiously to reroute cables. The coolant canister lay empty at her feet. Riken climbed a ladder to reach her. She glanced over, relief crossing her face, then turned back to the console. The translator beeped from his belt. "Leaking valve, meltdown soon, must fix." He nodded, eyes scanning the hazard-laden environment. Flickering readouts indicated rising pressure. If they didn't vent the heat soon, the generator would blow. A thick pipe overhead rattled with every convulsion of the station's failing systems. "Check that valve!" he shouted, pointing. She looked where he gestured, nodded, and nimbly moved to the next set of controls. He used the translator's interface to interpret the alien script, toggling an override that forced an external vent to open. At once, a shriek of escaping steam filled the chamber. Pressure readouts dipped. Zyril whooped, or the alien equivalent, though it came out as a sharp hiss of triumph. She gave him a quick grin. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had a fighting chance. They worked side by side, reconnecting severed cables, bypassing fried circuits, and forcing the ancient system to limp on. Time blurred into a sweaty, frantic haze. At last, the generator settled into a low, stable hum. The meltdown alarms subsided, replaced by a few cautionary lights. Zyril slumped against the console, tail curling around her own leg. Riken pressed a command to check overall stability. It was barely green, but it was green nonetheless. Exhausted, he turned to face her. Sweat glistened on his forehead. She looked just as spent, her scaled arms streaked with grime, luminous eyes half-lidded. Without thinking, he reached out and wiped a smudge of grease from her cheek. She caught his hand, guiding it to her mouth. Her lips brushed his knuckles, a tender gesture that made his chest tighten. In that quiet chamber, overshadowed by the generator's hum, they shared a moment of triumph and unspoken gratitude. He leaned in, letting his forehead rest against hers. She let out a contented hum, her tail loosening, drifting to brush his thigh. He murmured, "We're alive," though the translator remained quiet. His tone must have carried the meaning because she smiled softly, her breath feathering against his lips. They lingered a moment longer, bodies still vibrating with the tension of near disaster. Finally, she nudged him with her shoulder, pointing toward the corridor. They had stabilized the station, but their corvette was still in dire need of more repairs. And no telling if the slavers or corporate patrols might track them here eventually. They had to keep moving. He nodded, and together they climbed down from the platform. The next few hours were a whirlwind of scrounging for parts, sealing cracks in the dome, and hauling what salvageable materials they could back to the corvette. Zyril found a stash of old but functional coolant lines, enough to further repair their reactor. Riken discovered a small cargo of field rations. They worked in near silence, using gestures and occasional translator prompts to coordinate. Each time they locked eyes, a subtle heat passed between them, recalling the intimacy they'd shared. But for now, survival took precedence. By the time they'd patched the ship enough to risk another flight, the faint star had dipped below the horizon, blanketing the rocky world in twilight. Zyril looked at Riken, tail swaying slightly. Her eyes glowed in the low light, reflecting the distant starlight overhead. He hesitated, wanting to reach out for her, but unsure if she wanted more closeness amid the exhaustion. She bridged the gap first, sliding her arms around his waist and nuzzling against his chest. His heart thundered. He wrapped an arm around her, resting his chin atop her head. They stood there for a while, the emptiness of space stretching beyond, the battered corvette behind them, and the promise of uncertain tomorrows looming. Yet in that embrace, Riken felt grounded, as though he'd finally found a piece of the galaxy worth protecting, and it was right here in his arms. Eventually, they boarded the corvette again. With the new coolant lines installed, the reactor's temperature fell to a manageable level. Riken powered up the engines with a tentative hope. The thrusters roared, steadier than before. He glanced at Zyril, who gave him an approving nod. They lifted off the surface in a swirl of dust, the battered hull holding together by a thread but still functional. As they rose into the star-flecked void, Riken allowed himself a small grin. They were battered, exhausted, and far from safe, but at least they had each other. Once the autopilot engaged, charting a course to a less hostile sector, they retreated to the cockpit's cramped living space. The overhead lights flickered in protest, but it was home enough. Zyril slumped onto one of the seats, exhaling with relief. Riken removed his gloves, approached her, and gently lifted her tail. She sucked in a breath, eyes locking with his. There was a hint of wariness there, but also anticipation. He ran his thumb over the scaled ridges, recalling her earlier shivers. A blush tinted her cheeks. He could see the memory in her eyes, that moment of fervor when he'd spanked her tail in the throes of passion, and how she'd whimpered afterward. He traced the spot carefully, ensuring there was no actual injury. Her body gave a little shudder. "Still sore?" he asked quietly, not expecting the translator to catch that tone. She released a soft, affirmative hum, followed by a sheepish grin that betrayed she didn't entirely mind the lingering tenderness. His heart flipped. She parted her lips, exhaling in a near-silent moan when he applied gentle pressure. His protective instincts warred with his desire. He leaned closer, pressing a light kiss to the base of her tail. She tensed, letting out a trembling laugh that melted into a sigh. Her hand cupped his cheek, urging him upward. He settled beside her, and she nestled against his chest, eyes drifting shut in contentment. He let her rest, stroking her back. The monotony of the engine's hum lulled him, and soon he dozed off with her curled into him. Dreams flickered through his mind, memories of the outpost, the luminous pool, the starlit horizon. He woke to the subtle shift of the ship as it maneuvered through a gravimetric field. Zyril stirred against him, blinking sleepily. She offered him a small, hesitant smile that sent warmth flooding through his veins. The translator was clipped to his belt, but in that intimate moment, they didn't need it. Still, eventually, he wanted to talk. Really talk. To know more about her, to share more of himself. He toyed with the translator's settings, trying to calibrate it better to her speech. She watched him with mild curiosity, her tail curled in her lap. Once he'd done what he could, he gestured for her to speak. She uttered a soft phrase. The device spat out broken words. "Exile me, they chase." Riken tried not to let his surprise show. So she was in exile. He pressed for more. She offered a few halting sentences. The gist, as best the translator could manage, was that she was from a proud lineage, but had been cast out for refusing some archaic tradition, possibly a forced bonding or a political arrangement. Slavers and corporate agents were after her because her species was rare and prized for their bioluminescent physiology and rumored healing properties. He nodded grimly, anger welling. He knew too well how the galaxy exploited the vulnerable. He took her hand, squeezing gently, silently promising her she wouldn't face that fate while he still breathed. She cupped his jaw, tilting his face so she could look into his eyes, her own shining with the gratitude the translator couldn't replicate. He swallowed hard. "Me," he said, tapping his chest. "Riken." Then pointing at her. "Zyril." She gave a firm nod. Her lips parted, forming his name in her own accent. "Riken." Something about the way she said it made his stomach flutter. He smiled, repeating her name softly, shaping each syllable with care. Her tail came around and brushed his leg in that gentle, affectionate manner. They both laughed quietly, a shared moment of levity amid the tension of survival. They discussed their next moves in broken phrases. Zyril wanted to find a hidden system where her kind once thrived, searching for sanctuary or perhaps a clue to reclaim her place. Riken considered the dangers. Corporate slavers had eyes everywhere. But she believed her people's old territory lay beyond the frontier, where few star charts ventured. If they could slip past the more policed trade routes, they might avoid detection. He agreed it was worth a shot. After all, he had no illusions about returning to a normal life. Not when his own wanted status was sure to resurface. If they kept moving together, maybe they had a chance. Over the next few days of travel, they fell into a routine. Riken tinkered with the corvette's battered systems, coaxing better performance from the engines. Zyril studied star maps, deciphering half-lost coordinates from memory and data caches. They slept entwined in the cramped bunk, exchanging comfort in the dark hours. Every so often, the translator would catch an intimate snippet of her whispers, but rarely enough to spoil the mystery of her language. More often, they communicated through touches, glances, and the subtle alignment of their bodies. Their emotional connection deepened with each passing day, a slow burn that crackled every time they brushed lips or lingered over a soft caress. He teased her occasionally about her tail, drawing out shy smiles and playful swats. She responded with banter of her own, though in halting phrases. Sometimes it took the translator an extra second to catch up, turning her comeback into a humorous delay that made them both laugh. The sexual tension never disappeared, especially when she'd stretch or bend to examine a console, her tail arching in a way that drew his gaze. She often caught him staring, and her cheeks would flush a deeper hue, the luminescence in her pupils shimmering with amusement or reciprocated desire. When they fell into bed, sometimes they fell into that heated dance of bodies again, exploring the boundaries of pleasure and trust. One evening, with the corvette drifting in the blackness between star systems, they found themselves in the cockpit, silent except for the hum of life support. A swirl of cosmic dust glowed beyond the viewport, painting Zyral's face in iridescent light. She leaned against Riken's shoulder, tail coiled at his feet, as they gazed at the infinite sprawl of stars. She exhaled softly, and the translator caught a stray phrase. "Safe now, with you." He froze, heart racing. She'd never said anything that direct. He turned to her, seeing the vulnerability in her gaze. Carefully, he curled a hand around the small of her back, pressing her closer. "I want to be," he said, though the translator only chirped a partial echo. She stared, not fully comprehending the words, but clearly understanding his tone. A small, trembling smile lifted her lips. She stretched up, pulling him into a languid kiss that tasted of tears, relief, and hope. They remained that way for a time, simply breathing each other in. Eventually, Riken drew back, shifting to scoop her into his lap. She let out a startled squeak, but then wrapped her arms around his neck, laughing softly. He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, then trailed his lips along her temple, down to her ear ridge, making her shiver. The translator, forgotten, clattered to the floor. She nestled against him, tail draped over his leg. He felt the beating of her heart against his chest, a quick rhythm that matched his own. Drifting on that wave of contentment, they lost track of time. The starfields turned, and eventually they dozed off in each other's arms, the console's faint beeps lulling them. For once, neither worried about immediate danger. In that small window of peace, they simply existed together, two exiles forging a fragile bond in the vast emptiness of space. When the console alarm finally woke them, it was because they'd entered the fringes of an unmapped sector. Zyral stirred, rubbing her eyes. She peered at the readouts, brow furrowing with focus, then brightening when the sensors confirmed the partial coordinates she'd recognized. They were close to a rumored region where her people might have once held dominion. She shot Riken a look of eager anticipation, then entered a course correction. He let her lead. This was her quest, and he was here to support it. As the corvette soared deeper into unknown space, Riken's mind raced with questions. What if her people were still out here? Would they accept her after her exile? Would they accept him? He glanced at Zyral, noting the determination etched across her features. Whatever they encountered, he'd stand by her side. He owed her that, and more. Over the next few days, they navigated the labyrinth of cosmic dust clouds and hidden gravitational wells. The ship's sensors flickered in and out, battered by electromagnetic interference. Twice, they nearly slammed into drifting asteroids. Riken's nerves were frayed by the time they emerged into a pocket of calm. Before them stretched a ringed planet orbited by multiple moons, each coated in swirling cloud layers. Something about it felt ancient, almost mystical. Zyral sucked in a breath, pointing at the second moon. The translator beeped. "Holy land, old home!" She turned to him, eyes brimming with tears. With a resolute nod, he guided the corvette toward it. The surface bristled with silver forests and shimmering lakes. It was breathtaking. They found an atmospheric gap and descended, the corvette rattling in protest. They touched down in a clearing near a towering structure, an array of spires that glowed with bioluminescent markings. It looked older than any civilization Riken had encountered, reminiscent of the style they'd seen in the hidden outpost chamber, only grander. Zyral nearly leapt out of her seat in excitement. She practically dragged him to the airlock once they landed. Adrenaline and a sense of awe spurred them on. Stepping onto the moon's surface, Riken felt a gentle breeze, pleasantly cool against his skin. The sky was tinged with purples and blues, a perpetual twilight. Bioluminescent plants dotted the clearing, their soft glow reflecting in Xyrel's eyes. She inhaled deeply, as if savoring the scent of a long-lost home. He squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back. They approached the spires, which rose like petrified trees. A faint hum emanated from within. Xyrel ran her fingertips over intricate carvings, each symbol lighting up under her touch. She seemed both awestruck and fearful. Then, an echoing hum answered, reverberating through the structure. Riken tensed, wondering if they triggered a defense system or an ancient sentinel. But Xyrel closed her eyes, her face a picture of calm. She hummed back, voice quivering with emotion. A section of the spire parted, revealing an entrance. Soft lights pulsed within. Xyrel glanced at Riken, tears shining at the corners of her eyes. He nodded, heart pounding. Step by step, they ventured inside, guided by a corridor lined with luminous vines. The interior was cavernous, alive with the gentle glow of bioluminescent crystals. Every surface was etched with swirling patterns, reminiscent of the marks on Xyrel's skin. They passed archways and chambers that resonated with faint music, as if the structure itself was singing. Xyrel led him deeper, pausing occasionally to rest her palm against a glowing panel. Each time, the spire's hum intensified, responding to her presence. Riken felt like an intruder in a sacred place, but Xyrel's steady grip on his arm reassured him that he was welcome at her side. At last, they emerged into a grand hall. A massive mosaic on the floor depicted a stylized representation of her species, tall forms with sweeping tails and radiant eyes. In the mosaic's center, an orb glowed with swirling light. Xyrel approached it, her tail quivering in anticipation. She knelt, touching her forehead to the orb. A surge of energy rippled outward, washing the chamber in shifting colors. Riken staggered, momentarily blinded by the brightness. When the radiance subsided, the orb's glow dimmed. Xyrel rose, tears streaming down her cheeks. She turned to Riken and spoke, the translator on his belt flickering to life. "They gone, only echoes left." Her voice broke. She gestured around, indicating the emptiness. Her people, or at least this branch of them, were long vanished. All that remained were these deserted halls and ancient illusions. Riken swallowed the lump in his throat. He opened his arms, and she fell into them, sobbing quietly. He held her close, one hand stroking the back of her head, the other cupping her trembling tail. The chamber's lights pulsed gently, as if sharing in her sorrow. They stayed that way for a while, letting the waves of grief pass. Eventually Xyrel pulled back, wiping her tears. She glanced around, then moved to an alcove that contained a data-like terminal. She traced glyphs with determined precision. The translator picked up fragments. Records, knowledge, preserve. She was searching for any surviving information that could guide her next steps. Perhaps there was a clue about other enclaves of her people or ways to resurrect what had been lost. As she worked, Riken stayed by her side, hand resting lightly on her shoulder. After a few moments, the console lit up, displaying holographic images of star charts, cultural records, and genealogical lines. Xyrel inhaled a shaky breath, scanning the data. The translator occasionally offered glimpses. Some survivors scattered, hidden worlds uncertain. Her eyes flicked to Riken, and he saw renewed hope flicker across her features. So not all was lost. There could be pockets of her species somewhere in the galaxy. She nodded at him, as if to say, "Let's keep searching." They spent hours in the spire, collecting any data that might be useful. Occasionally, they paused to explore side chambers, each revealing more of her culture's elegance. Water gardens lit by glowing lilies, meditation rooms resonating with haunting chords, murals depicting epic migrations. Everywhere, the absence of living inhabitants pressed down on them. It was a tomb of beauty, a testament to what had once been. Riken did his best to comfort her, offering silent support whenever she looked close to breaking down. At last, they returned to the main hall. The orb sat at the mosaic's center, a silent witness to their presence. Zyril approached it one last time, resting her palm against its surface. She whispered something that the translator didn't catch, but Riken guessed it was a farewell or a prayer. Then, turning to him, she managed a soft smile. They had a new mission now: find any remnants of her people, rebuild or at least ensure they survived somewhere. He nodded, heart aching for her loss but determined to stand by her side. Hand in hand, they left the spire, stepping into the cool twilight. The corvette waited in the clearing, a battered lifeline to the rest of the galaxy. As they neared the ship, Riken slipped an arm around Zyril's waist, pulling her close. She melted into him, letting out a sigh that sounded both weary and resolute. His lips found her forehead, pressing a gentle kiss there. She nuzzled his chest, tail curling around his leg with that familiar intimacy. In that moment, the swirl of conflicting emotions, grief, hope, desire, devotion, united in a quiet sense of belonging. They might be the only two souls on this moon, but they had each other. Zyril paused before entering the corvette, turning to gaze at the spires one last time. Her eyes shimmered with reflected light. Slowly, she raised her hand in a gesture of respect, then lowered it, letting the final vestiges of her old life rest. Riken slid the ramp shut behind them, sealing in a hush that was broken only by the ship's gentle hum. She turned to him, eyes shining. He stroked her cheek, and she guided his hand to the back of her neck, leaning into his warmth. Their foreheads touched, and she spoke, letting the translator catch the words. "Thank you for staying." His heart clenched. He cupped her face in both hands, searching for a way to convey how much she meant to him. Instead of words, he kissed her, pouring every ounce of his devotion into it. She responded with a soft moan, her fingers tangling in his hair. It was a kiss that tasted of tears and the promise of tomorrow, an unspoken vow to face whatever the galaxy hurled at them. They fell together onto the narrow bunk in the dim glow of the cabin lights. This time, their lovemaking was less frantic, more reverent. Each touch was an affirmation: we survived, we move forward, we cherish each other. He trailed kisses along her neck, over the ridges of her shoulders, and down her arms. She arched beneath him, tail coiling around his torso in a tender embrace. When he caressed the sensitive base of her tail, she whimpered, half laughing through her tears. He hushed her with soft lips, letting her know she was safe. In return, she explored his body, leaving searing lines of sensation wherever her scaled fingers wandered. They moved in a slow, intimate rhythm, weaving their bodies together until the boundaries between them blurred. Afterward, they lay intertwined, hearts pounding in unison. She clung to him, face pressed to the crook of his neck, breathing unevenly. He stroked her hair, her back, and that tender place on her tail, mindful of the earlier marks he'd left. She shivered but didn't pull away, letting him cradle her in protective arms. Time slipped away. Eventually they dozed, lulled by each other's warmth. They awoke to the corvette's gentle autopilot beep, reminding them that they couldn't stay here forever. Zyril dressed silently, her expression pensive. Riken rubbed sleep from his eyes and slid into the pilot's seat. Together, they charted a route that would take them to the next set of coordinates gleaned from the spire's data banks. It might be a wild goose chase, or it might lead to the last vestiges of her people. Either way, they would face it together. Lifting off from the moon's surface felt bittersweet. Zyril gazed out the viewport, watching the spires recede into the violet horizon. Riken reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. She squeezed back, offering him a small, hopeful smile. The corvette rose into the starry sky, leaving behind the cradle of an ancient civilization. In that silent farewell, Riken felt the weight of everything they'd lost, and everything they'd gained. A future, however uncertain, stretched before them. They soared into the void, the battered ship humming with renewed purpose. Zyril angled the star maps, aligning them with the console's new readings. Riken plotted a course, lips curving into a subtle grin. "Ready?" he asked. She turned her luminous eyes on him, and nodded. Then she leaned in close, brushing her mouth softly over his, sealing the moment with a kiss. He engaged the FTL drive, and with a roar and a streak of light, they vanished into the infinite darkness, side by side, hearts aflame with a love that defied every star in the galaxy.